Well, welcome back to No to NATO, No to War, the show worldwide that broadcaster George Galloway formed and started, and it's now making its way to your screens and your devices and your computers all around the world. We're broadcasting live from Sydney this morning. It's 8 o'clock in Sydney, and welcome to everyone who's watching. Make sure you hit the share button, hit the like button, and get this stream out there. These are the type of shows that they don't want you to watch. The mainstream media does not want you to see what's going to happen here, because as the title of the show suggests, this morning in Australia and this evening in the UK, Vladimir Putin has said everyone must mobilize. Now, what does he mean by that? I'll go into that during the show. But Vladimir Putin was talking to his own people. He was talking to his staffers, his government officials, and to be honest, I really liked it. I really liked Vladimir Putin's attitude. Let's have a look at what he said.
Все должны работать как на линии фронта. Все должны чувствовать себя
Everyone must feel mobilized, is what Vladimir Putin has instructed.
работать как на линии фронта. Все должны чувствовать себя
Well, Vladimir Putin, very serious, very angry, very to the point. He's telling his own officials, his own government workers to be mobilized, to be in the game, to be in the fight. Russia is completely preparing for a very serious escalation, a very serious battle as we move closer into World War III, and it certainly is becoming World War III, as we can see what's happening in Syria in the last few hours and days. The city of Homs about to be taken. It looks like World War III is unleashing everywhere. And breaking news, the tsunami warning off the coast of California has been called off after a series of earthquakes hit the California area. Some may say that's a sign from God. God's punishing the United States. But let's see. We hope the United States gets better. The United States has been ill. They've been under occupation of the Biden government for the last few years, under the occupation of the deep state. Let's see what the Trump-Elon Musk presidency brings. And speaking of Elon Musk, I was very impressed to see a decision by the courts, it seems, that our colleague and friend George Galloway had a win against Elon Musk's ex in his case for defamation. Now, it's been ordered that costs will be paid to George Galloway by Elon Musk, by X, and of course, this refers to a case of defamation before Elon Musk took over the platform. But congratulations to George Galloway. Certainly, that's a very good win, and that's a developing situation. But what I like most for myself personally is that George Galloway promised on air, live, in the terms of the settlement with Elon Musk in that case, to demand the restoration of the Aussie Cossack Twitter X channel, which was suspended a day before the US election. So as a reminder, just remember what George said there.
The Cossack is one of our favorite people. He's so good, they're seeking to ban him here, there, and everywhere, but he'll never be banned from our portals. Aussie Cossack, welcome to No to NATO, No to War. I can well see, as the audience will, from your knowledge and eloquence, why they want to silence you, but you will never be silenced. People can follow you on Telegram. Tell them how, please.
Follow me on Telegram, Aussie Cossack on Telegram, and tag Elon Musk, put up a tweet and say, bring back the Cossack hashtag. Look, I'm not an enemy of Elon Musk. I'm pretty favorable to him and Trump, because I don't want Kamala to win. So it's unusual why I was banned from Twitter. Maybe they'll restore me. But thank you very much, George, for the opportunity. And it was great to see you.
No, you took words out of my mouth. I was going to make a call to everyone watching this who has an account on X, on Twitter, to raise the demand to bring back the Cossack, because your voice was increasingly influential, which is, of course, why people tried to silence you. I myself am determined to see you back. I'm in court with Elon Musk in the next few months in my action against Twitter. I think I'll add that to my list of demands. In order to settle the case, one of the terms
It's very made those demands on my behalf to Elon Musk. So I'm watching that case very, very closely. I mean, Elon Musk says he's the champion of free speech, but clearly there are some things where he gives into pressure. I mean, the Australian government has been pressuring Elon Musk for, I would say, the last year to close or suspend certain accounts, including my own account, for the fact that we are sympathetic to Russia. Or I am sympathetic to Russia. We do say no to NATO. We do call out the narrative of the NATO mainstream media deep state conglomerate. And of course, that's something which they don't like. But Elon Musk was staunch. I don't know what happened the day before the elections. Suddenly, many Russian accounts were suspended. What the media hides, VicTop, there was a whole raft of them suspended. And it is unfortunate. Not even pro-Russian accounts. Just, I don't know what the reasoning or the logic is behind that process. But it's, of course, it's very good to have George fighting in the corner, in my corner, so to speak. Thank you, George Galloway, that he is a gentleman and he stays true to his word. So I'll be watching that closely. But look, why is it that they want to shut us down? Why is it that they want to censor us? It's because what we say here on this show, what we say here on our platforms, we do challenge the NATO narrative. And at this time in history, more than ever, we need an alternate voice. We can see clearly what goes on. Bill Gates was exposed just a few days ago for sponsoring the BBC, CNBC, all of the major networks to the tune of $300 million to push his talking points. So how can we fight against these type of assets, these type of corporations that they have at their disposal? Well, we do fight. We are the little guys, and we do the best job we can with your help, of course. And you'll see the QR code on the screen if you want to support tonight's show and this project in general, No to NATO. It's a very good cause to support. If we don't have an alternate voice, the propaganda war, and it is a propaganda war, let's just face it, and what we're engaged in is propaganda, and we're engaged in fighting propaganda, and it's futile to deny that. So let's just be completely honest that that is what goes on. Now, the Russian side, the Russian government, the Russian media is more or less censored everywhere, all over the Western world. And our show, No to NATO, is broadcasting in the Western world. It's broadcasting in those places where the Russian perspective is forbidden, is considered misinformation or disinformation or fake news, as they would say. But it's up to the viewer. I mean, the viewer who is you watching tonight or this morning, if you're in Australia, should be able to make the choice. Do you want to watch propaganda from the Pentagon or propaganda from Tel Aviv or propaganda from Brussels or propaganda from Moscow or Beijing or London? Well, if I was you, I'd probably watch a little bit of everything and then make a decision based on a smorgasbord of opinions and facts. Now, when the government restricts us from doing so, when the government restricts us from obtaining information from certain sources, of course, it throws a spanner in the works and it's not a fair playing field. So there we go. Let's hope Elon Musk lives up to his reputation as the person who stands up for freedom of speech and restores many X accounts on Twitter. But look, that's not the only attack there has been. In fact, just yesterday, the Australian media agency called The Nightly had a crack at the Aussie Cossack. Now, this is the thing. If we weren't doing anything useful, if we weren't doing anything that was making an impact, for example, this show, No to NATO, they wouldn't bother attacking us, would they? They wouldn't see us as a threat. They wouldn't see us as something to go after and something to persecute. Well, there was an article written yesterday by a lady called Latika Burke. She used to write for the Sydney Morning Herald for a number of years, and she would often write pieces attacking Julian Assange, our Australian colleague and freedom fighter and truth seeker. Now, she used to attack Assange a lot with her usual lies and smears against him. and she seems to be a complete shill and sycophant for the powers that be. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute that she refers to, also known as ASPI, is a US-paid think tank that seeks to paint China and Russia and whoever the US has in its sights as a threat. Now, this Latina Burke, this journalist, refers to Assange as a convicted felon. We all know that Assange has been convicted, but he's certainly not a felon. He's not a criminal. In fact, I think he should be pardoned. I think it's an outrage that Biden, in his last days of his presidency, is pardoning his own son, Hunter, for those despicable crimes, terrible crimes. Now, Hunter Biden is a felon. Hunter Biden is a criminal. Hunter Biden is a degenerate. But unlike Julian Assange, he has got a pardon, and Assange is still waiting for his pardon. Now, here we are looking at Latina Burke's article. Let's have a look at Latina Burke, what she's written here. Now, this article is titled, Simeon Boykov, Ukrainians call on Penny Wong to kick out Russian agent Aussie Cossack in the Sydney consulate. Now, for those of you who are watching the first time, I have been locked in the Sydney Russian consulate in Australia for the last 2 years. I was born in Australia, grew up on the streets of Sydney, Russian heritage, and of course, that became almost illegal. In Australia, it's almost illegal to be someone who is a pro-Russian person and who is overtly pro-Russian, who flaunts his pro-Russian views or his anti-NATO views, because there are a lot of people in Australia who aren't Russian and are pro-Russian, and I take my hat off to them every time. Many Australians stand up to the Australian government's policy of warmongering and delivering weapons to the Zelensky regime. But let's have a look at this article to see what they had to say, because I'd love to take it apart. Now, one of their sources, the people that they quote, is Katerina Arguru, a co-chair of the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organizations. Now, this organization is basically you could say, descendant organization or daughter organization of those old Bandera Nazi diaspora groups that were around since the 1950s and 1960s. And although this lady Katerina has been in Australia recently, she immigrated from Ukraine, she feels confident enough to say that while the Australian government refuses to close Russia's embassy in Canberra in response to Moscow's campaign of terror and genocide in Ukraine, we urge the government to at least shut down the Sydney consulate and send Russia's diplomats and spies packing. Well, look, that's where I am in the Russian consulate. There are no spies here. I can guarantee you, because if there were, I would probably be drinking vodka with them and singing Russian songs with an accordion every evening. But unfortunately, there are no spies. And Australia simply is just not interesting enough for Russia to commit resources and conduct espionage in. There's simply nothing in Australia that Russia seeks. What would Russia need from Australia? Australia doesn't have any significant strategic value or military assets or secrets or technology that Russia needs. So unfortunately for the Ukrainians, they're off the mark on that one. But she goes on to say, a consulate should not be used to undermine another country's sovereignty. It makes a mockery of the traditional function of a consulate. Let's get her off a screen. Can't stand looking at her, but I'll be honest with you. It is good that the Australian government respect the inviolability of the Russian consulate or the Russian embassy, because that means that in the future, if any Australian citizen anywhere around the world, especially in BRICS countries or countries allied to Russia, such as China, for example, was to perform a similar stunt and defect or seek diplomatic asylum, it sets a precedence. So the fact that the Australian government tolerates the Aussie Cossacks diplomatic asylum situation in the Russian consulate, and it's been going for 2 years, notwithstanding the pressure of the Ukrainian community. In fact, it's not only the Ukrainian community who is making such demands. It's also senators like Simon Birmingham, who is a Liberal senator, but he's on the way out. He's resigning. We don't know what the exact reason is why he's resigning, but Simon Birmingham has been an extremely loud voice for handing over weapons to Ukraine. He's been obsessed with the concept of let's fund Zelensky, let's give him more, let's give him Bushmasters, let's give him artillery, let's give him shells, drones, taxpayer money. And now he's on the way out. Now, before he leaves, and he's leaving now as we speak, he's resigning from politics. Again, we don't know why. Maybe there's, as the Russians call it, compromat that has appeared on him, and he's just decided it's too much to handle. He's leaving. But Simon Birmingham says the Albanese government needs to be upfront about the extent Russian diplomatic posts in Australia are being used to conduct foreign interference rather than consular activities. The transnational dimension of this case involving Semyon Boykov, a Russian propagandist operating in Australia, reflects the complex and borderless nature of hybrid threats. Well, to be honest, I sent this to my colleagues in Russia and I published it on the Telegram channel Aussie Cossack. People are very impressed. Thank you very much, Simon Birmingham. If you're of such a opinion of the Aussie Cossack, transnational dimension of this case, right? Russian propagandist reflects the complex and borderless nature of hybrid warfare. There you go. Paul Meany's got a comment. Aussie Cossack, a hounded Australian-born second-generation ethnic Russian, political prisoner of conscience, hounded by genocide war criminal Albanese, simply for being Russian in the footsteps of Assange. Thank you very much, Paul Meany. Look, the people get it. People can see straight through the tactics and lies of the government. We'll go on further to this article because it's important we take it apart. Dr. Fitriani, a senior analyst of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI. Now, ASPI, what is ASPI? It's an organization, it's a think tank in Australia, which is funded by the US Embassy and the US Department of Defense. So it's basically a pro-American propaganda outfit. Boykov's role as a registered foreign agent adds another layer linking the operation to state-backed disinformation efforts. Australia could be implicated due to Semyon Boykov, as he is a registered Russian foreign agent operating from Australian territory. Geez, you've got me worried there. You've got me worried there. What am I going to do? Dr. Fitriani has cracked the case. She's figured it out, that Boykov is a registered foreign agent. You know, the fact that I'm a registered foreign agent means I'm not covert. The fact that I'm registered means I have nothing to hide. The fact that I've registered myself and I've said, yes, I am a journalist. Yes, I create multimedia and give commentary and political opinions on the situation. Yes, by the way, I'm not second generation Russian. It's my great-grandparents who were born in Australia. So they've been here since many, many years. My great-grandparents actually left the Russian Empire during the Russian Revolution. So that goes to show, the connection to Russia. And of course, yes, I am in the Russian consulate, but for the record, let me get this on the record. The Russian diplomats, the Russian consulate does not in any way, shape or form dictate or interfere with what I'm doing, right? I was always politically active in Australia, where I was born in 1990, went to primary school, played rugby union for the Trinity Grammar School, first 15, went on to have a career in Labour High in the building game. And what can I say? I'm born in Australia, had nothing to do with the Russian government, but it's because of the persecution of the Australian government, the persecution of the Albanese government, that I decided to hand myself into the Russians and ask for asylum. And God bless Vladimir Putin. He said, welcome. He said, here's a Russian passport. You can become a Russian citizen. And I only got my Russian citizenship on the 8th month of being in the consulate. So there we go. For those people who think that I am a state-backed disinformation actor, and they're trying to say that I'm a Russian foreign agent. It's a self-declared foreign agent. For those of you who don't believe me, I'm just going to play this clip now. Have a look at what the Aussie Cossack was doing before the Russia-Ukraine conflict, before 2022. And tell me for yourselves, viewers at home, does this look like what a Russian agent would do if he was in Australia operating on behalf of the Kremlin? Have a look. Hello, Aussie Cossack here from the Sydney Russian Consulate.
Put your hands together for the Aussie Cossack.
No to the Greens, no to Labor, no to Liberals.
Putin influencer.
Have a very interesting conversation with a very interesting guest, Semyon Boykov.
Calling himself the Aussie Cossack.
You're scared of the Aussie Cossack, you're scared of the Aussie people. The Aussie Cossack has been released.
So what do we hear from the Aussie Cossack? We've got the Aussie Cossack standing as an independent.
Thanks, buddy.
Let's all get together. Let's all join together and support the Aussie Cossack in Strathfield.
You like the setup? Very presidential. This is embarrassing.
Big pharma, big media, and big government, and deep state.
Big dislike from the Aussie Cossack.
Сегодня в Австралии люди собрались на могиле.
Why do you support Vladimir Putin? Penny Wong just put sanctions on Russia again. Penny Wong talking tough.
He mentioned the name of an alleged pedophile and they locked him up. But here he is. mobilise! The Aussie Cossack!
There you go, the dirty tactics of the Australian Federal Police. No one in the government has apologised to us yet. No one has said sorry.
We should become a republic. For goodness sake. Become a republic. Let's have neutrality.
You're a journalist first and foremost. Very popular.
You wanted to arrest journalists. You wanted to fight freedom of speech.
Aussie Cossack, et qui est un fugitif.
Let them go! Let them go! Are they going to chase me? My own mother is hiding from the camera.
Dora, keep up the good work. You made a very nice young man.
This is a disgrace.
Why am I doing this? I'm just getting a selfie with you.
No, you're not. You're just annoying.
No, you're just a disgrace. He just called the police. They see the Aussie Cossack, they run for cover. Because we are the working class, we are the people, and we're going to take this state seat back, aren't we? How are you?
Good. Welcome back.
Great to see you again.
You too. Good to be back here.
This guy here, right? Or this guy. Which one has a nicer face? This is Democracy Manifest. This is how the Liberal Party treats journalists. I'm a very dangerous individual. It says in the intro.
I'm asking you to leave.
And we're in court today for some absolutely ridiculous charges.
Let's clean out the parliament and sack them all!
But it's very funny. We have another custom. Now, for your safety, I think it's better we have the mic rolling. Told none of your business, just like I told you.
And I gotta shut down Andrew!
I'm the Aussie Cossack. It's been a pleasure.
Like and subscribe.
Let the audience decide, does that look like the typical Russian foreign agent? Let me know in the comments below. Have you ever seen a Russian agent who behaves like that on the streets of Australia, streets of Sydney? According to the mainstream media, that is a Kremlin-backed misinformation, disinformation agent. Well, we'll leave it to the people to decide. But that puts a bit of context as to what we're doing and why we're fighting, because the persecution of the government is next level. And anyone puts their head above the line, tall poppy syndrome, they'll come and they'll whack you like a whack-a-mole game at the school fetes that you used to go to. But what can you do? We'll just keep fighting, and we appreciate George Galloway and this show to be able to give us a platform and speak from Australia, breaking through the chains of censorship. But enough of the domestic front of Australia, unless you want to keep talking about that. Let me know in the comment section. I'll read your comments out on the screen. But I want to now go to our extinguished guest. We've got a great lineup tonight on tonight's show of No2Nato. Now, Mick Stott is coming right up, and he's a retired captain who served in the British Army for 30 years in the Physical Training Corps. He now specializes in the effective treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. Mick, it's a pleasure to welcome you to No2Nato.
Thank you, Simeon. It's really interesting watching your story, because one of the topics that I'd like to discuss is sovereignty. And of course, the biggest question is our sovereignty. One of the only people that I think is calling it out is George. And of course, the Workers' Party, that was one of the reasons that I connected with it. But equally, right at the start, when COVID came out, having served for a number of years, I was always very skeptical of some of the decisions that the government made. And so no surprise to me that when Ofcom started to censor voices, that was a typical tactic of any regime or organization that wanted to control a narrative. And you can't possibly control a narrative in what's supposed to be a democratic country, because that's completely the antithesis to democracy. So knowing what we knew about Iraq and Tony Blair being an international war criminal, it comes as a surprise to an awful lot of people. You know, for me as a serving soldier of 30 years, I find it very interesting to even challenge the reasons that I joined the military, having spent time on operations and also spent that amount of time in and around my fellow colleagues in the army. And so it would almost be heresy to suggest on any level that we would say no to NATO. But if we think about sovereignty and we think about who actually is pulling the strings and who controls our government, and we look at those lines of control, they're becoming more and more obvious. And so it might come as a surprise that when this all started to roll as far back as 2019, that I was very, very aware of something that was going on and the conversations that were blackballed in Parliament because of some of the people I was talking to. And what an awful lot of people that are still serving and veteran communities out there might not appreciate is that we do not have a sovereign force anymore. And we don't have a sovereign force because after Brexit was signed in 2019, revised and signed, in September 2019, 3 civil servants, namely Brockbank, Langley and Robbins, what they did was they signed us up to 8 EU contracts. And of course, those 8 EU contracts tied us up to Brussels, the oligarchs that are in Brussels. And a guy called Major General Campbell was aware of this, and he tried to fight this, but was silenced essentially. Major General Campbell was the commander that led the British forces into the Falklands conflict, which ironically is possibly the only legal war that we've been involved in because it involved sovereign turf. And of course, the defense of sovereign turf. So we can't possibly justify being in some of these places as a force. But the 8 EU contracts that came live on the 1st of January 2021, what they did was they pretty much said that if the EU has a bit of an issue and it wants to resolve an issue by the use of force, then the British would no longer get a say in that because they would be deployed by the EU. These contracts also, what they did was they took away any sovereignty because what it meant was that we could be tasked, deployed, procurement, and all of the types of functionality that we would normally keep within our own house, so to speak, would then be given away to Brussels and the oligarchs in Brussels. So essentially, the idea for any veteran or any serving person within the British forces at the moment that we are a British force is an absolute nonsense. And of course, some of us became very, very aware of this a long time ago. We started to wake up. And what I did as a matter of course, what I did was I started to train people to exercise the basic human rights and using the vehicle of natural law, because we wanted people to be able to say no to some of the things that we were being forced into. If we don't get a choice as to whether or not we engage with another country, then at that point, that is really, there's nothing sovereign about that. And equally, if we can't vote a government out fairly, then again, there is nothing sovereign about that. But sovereignty does actually start with the individual standing up and saying no. And of course, I don't buy into any element of war, having been there and understand what it does. It creates nothing but poverty, mayhem, and just situations that are devoid completely of love, care, and consideration. And it's normally those people that are on the receiving end of that have no say in it and suffer the worst. Meanwhile, the people that support and fund it are the ones who are then generating all the wealth from it. So there are no surprises that when you look at the arms that are going to Ukraine, that when you look at who's providing the arms and where the funds are going for those, they're going back to those companies that coincidentally run the world. And you know, people, I think, that bother to look will see that the BlackRocks, the Vanguards, the State Streets of this world are all very, very interested parties, because they're some of the main beneficiaries of that. And so people wake up at their own pace, I think. And one of the things that veterans and serving personnel should pay attention to is the fact that Keir Starmer in the last month stated that what he was going to do was he was going to reconnect and reaffiliate to the EU. Well, they'd already done that. Those contracts came live in 21. And so for me, that's known as retrospective honesty, because it's already happened. It was the hottest potato in Parliament when it was happening. People wouldn't even discuss it. And Keir Starmer, now that he came into power, which is no coincidence in my world, and nor is it a surprise that he's just continued to do more of what was being done before, and then added a considerable amount of weight to that as well. So when those contracts came live, we lost our sovereignty. We lost our sovereignty as a force. It's very, very unusual that we would ever send any of our hard work to any other situation. And I just think this was an excuse, a vehicle for amalgamating those contracts that had already been signed. So Starmer is using something called retrospective honesty in my book, and retrospective honesty is not honesty. It's because it would have to come out at some point. People would have to realise that it had already been done, and an awful lot of people were not aware of that. And of course, Starmer is a man of many faces, but mainly only uses two. So we don't really expect much honesty from someone like that. The thing that never ceases to surprise me is that all these people that decide to take us to war, you never see their children at the front line. They're never there holding rifle and bayonet right at the front. And so, as far as I'm concerned, our sovereignty was lost a considerable period of time ago, and the narrative that has reigned since then, the narrative is the mainstream media are still owned by the same people who want you to believe. And I have a simple philosophy. If your library is smaller than your TV, then there's a good chance you're going to believe everything that you see on TV. And that's not really much good for anyone. So it's really important that people do actually do their own homework and take a look at some of these things from their own perspectives. And I think I'm preaching to the converted when I talk about that on here. My main specialism after I resigned my commission in the military was post-traumatic stress disorder. And if you look at the build-up from COVID to where we are right now, governments have lied and cheated. If you look at the parties that were held in Parliament while we were being told to stay at home, all of those things literally were designed, as far as I'm concerned, to disrupt. And of course, when we start to disrupt everyday environments and everyday situations, that in itself creates a level of confusion, and it opens the door for potential trauma. One of the things that really excited me about the Workers' Party was when George did his speech at the Union, the Oxford Union, his speech, because he talked about the Tommy Atkins, which was the soldier that was forgotten. You know, the guy that was the average Tom, the average soldier, the unknown man, really, but was always at the forefront of all of this action. And of course, a lot of that, as we understand through the indoctrination of training, we get lost in that. So with regards to trauma, if you consider what is going on in the broader sense, if we interrupt your life and we interrupt your daily life, which happened, as I said, from 2020 onwards, then that in itself, even COVID, the situation with COVID had a huge impact on people. And, you know, I can measure this in the UK. There was an unbelievable impact on children that were forced to stay home, and then they didn't want to go back to school. So there was also.
Mick, I wanted to just stop you there. Look, you've made some very good points on sovereignty and the Keir Starmer government's disregard for the wishes of the people. I mean, the British people clearly don't want British involvement in Ukraine or British boots on the ground. Just yesterday, in a shocking revelation, British Defence Minister Alastair Cairns warned that the British Army could be destroyed within 6 months to a year in the event of a major war, similar to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. With the army at its smallest size since the 1700s, Cairns emphasised the critical role of reservists in maintaining the nation's defence capabilities. We all know, the British people know, other countries in the world know, I know, you know, and the Russians know, that the British military is extremely weak at the moment. It's in terms of numbers, in terms of morale, I would say also, and that's a question I want to put to you. It's not for me to speak on that. It's much more credible if you can comment on that. But morale in terms of, would British people, when we talk about reservists, would they be willing to get onto transport planes and fly to Poland to be transferred to the Russian front in Ukraine to go and fight for Zelensky? And probably a rhetorical question.
I don't think they would, and I don't think it will ever happen anyway. You know, I do talk to serving people, and these are some people that are right at the top of their tree. People that when I was serving, I took them through their journey into the military, and I did serve at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, which is the establishment that trains all of our officers and a number of other foreign officers. So it is pretty much the kite mark for the highest quality of training. So, you know, the question is, would people sign up to that? You know, there's a whole new tranche of people that are coming into this world right now, and they're taught emotional intelligence. Certainly when I went through school, EQ was never really something that was talked about or discussed. And that then spread into the military, where recruits could then sort of say, I'm not happy with the treatment I'm being given. This is a red card. This is a green card. Now, that was completely alien to anything that we would have ever been allowed to do when we were training as soldiers. So the whole essence of the training is designed to make somebody, let's say, more emotionally intelligent and aware. And in reality, in wartime, that's the last thing you want, because what will happen naturally is people will be more compassionate, they will be more considerate, they will be allowed to express their emotional states. And all of those don't necessarily equal a great fighting force. And they certainly, if you look at a situation that you've got in Ukraine at the moment, where British soldiers are volunteers. And of course, that's what makes them excellent soldiers, because they volunteered for the role. There's a massive difference between volunteering for a role and being forced into a role. And, you know, the old saying that one volunteer is worth 20 pressed men goes a long way. If you go back as far as World War I, what we recognised in World War I, that anything up to 30% of the people in the trenches weren't actually shooting at anyone because they didn't want to hurt anyone.
So just stop you there. You're saying that the British soldiers fighting in Ukraine are very good or effective, essentially, you're saying, because they're volunteers.
I think that a volunteer is always going to be more effective than a pressed man. I wouldn't say what the standard of a British soldier is these days, because I've seen a lot of mission creep when it comes to standards and qualification. Are they as good as they used to be? I suppose every older person might say, no, they're not as good as they are.
Look, I do agree on your point in terms of volunteers and people who are pressed into the military. If we look at the Ukrainian military, it's quite clear that is a military of soldiers who are forcibly recruited, arrested on the streets, kidnapped and thrown to the front lines. Meanwhile, on the Russian side, thanks to very wealthy Russian cash reserves through oil and gas and other exports, Russia is simply offering huge amounts of money to volunteers, to soldiers, and people are signing up. Something like 30,000 Russian men every month sign up to fight. And they receive huge, in Russian terms, even in Western terms, they receive huge wages, absolutely huge wages. So, I mean, Vladimir Putin has committed 1/3 of the country's budget to the war. And that, of course, predominantly goes to funding the social benefits and the wages of soldiers. And the good news is for the Russians, when the soldiers are being paid very well, extremely well, that money is then coming back into the Russian economy, to their families, to their wives, to their children, and being spent in Russian cities and towns. So it's a great strategy to pay your soldiers well. And in the event of death, there's also a very, very high remuneration, compensation, and insurance type situation. So, unlike the Ukrainian side, and we all know the motivation is very lacking on the Ukrainian side, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
But look, I can tell you that it's, even if it wasn't for the high wages in the Russian military, they'd still have Russian men signing up to fight, because it's a matter of defending Russia against a combined force of 55 countries all around the world. But look, it's good to hear your opinion as a veteran of 30 years in the British military. And what's your final closing statement What's your message to the Russian military, to the Russian soldiers? And knowing that Vladimir Putin has called upon everyone to mobilize, well, can I say that extends to all of us, and even you in Britain. You can all mobilize, and everyone can play their part. You can play your part, Mick, and your colleagues in the United Kingdom, because public opinion is a very important factor in any healthy democracy. And when public opinion is overwhelmingly against sending British Storm Shadow missiles or committing Britain to World War III, that's a great thing for de-escalation and a potential settlement of this conflict on Russia's terms. So, yeah, go ahead and your closing statement.
Yeah, I don't think that the government represent the opinion that is in the UK. If you look at what Sunak did when he talked about conscription, that literally was always going to lose him the vote. It was always going to lose him the vote, because your generations that we have now are not driven the same way that we're driven. They're used to greater lifestyles. They have a lot more money. They have a lot more wealth. So I think that that there is definitely a disconnect between what the politicians would like you to believe, the mainstream message that they give out, and the actual opinions of the average person. And I'm not convinced that we would be even remotely motivated to go and fight a conflict in that place, when in reality it isn't even a lawful war, because it's not defending our own sovereign turf. So it's an unlawful war, and it would be very, very hard to justify in the mind of a professional that bothers to do their research. And a lot of guys these days, they do their research. There's a lot of people that are waking up as we speak and saying no. And you can see this on Facebook with scoping strategies that the government use when they put an opinion out there, just to see how people respond to it. So I think there's a big disconnect, Simeon, and I think it's doomed to fail, to be honest. If the British people were forced into something, I think you would see a big reaction against them.
Can't say I disagree with you. In fact, I completely agree with you. And it's good to know that there are British veterans, many British veterans, experienced, seasoned veterans such as yourself, who are patriots of their country. And as patriots of their country, as you are, you see that this is the wrong thing for Britain. It's the wrong thing to be getting involved in a war against Russia. It's a dead end in the very real sense that it will bring about dead people, including British people. And that's not what Russia wants. And that's probably what Zelensky wants. Zelensky doesn't care how many people die to protect his own interests and his regime's interests. And unfortunately, on the chopping block first up are Ukrainians, and he's genociding his own people, and he's attracting all sorts of mercenaries and far-right fanatics and Nazis and extremists, foreign fighters from all around the world, from Colombia, from Australia, from New Zealand, from the United Kingdom, from Poland. Lots of Poles, lots of Polish people dying. Russian soldiers often report that they can hear Polish chatter on the radios, and they're discovering these mercenaries fighting not only in Ukraine, but actually invading Russian sovereign territory in the Kursk region. I mean,
well, the thing is, Timmy, and it's worth remembering this as well, if you look at the way the British government have treated the veteran, this is my closing statement. If you look at the prison population, on average, it's about 13% of the prison population are veterans. If you look at the probation population, about 13% of those are veterans, and they are the majority are non-habitual criminals. So George's speech at the Union was perfect, because what he says was that even if you do go to fight for your country, by the way, they're going to hang you out to dry when you get home.
Absolutely. Can't say I disagree. Thank you very much for joining us, Mick Stott, on No2Nato. Look, staying in the United Kingdom, we're going to jump now to our second guest for tonight's show. And this is a gentleman by the name of Warren Thornton. Now, Warren has served for 6 years as a sniper in the British Army, and for 8 years as protection for aid workers in war-torn countries. Effectively, he's a combat veteran being stationed overseas in these war zones. He's now a broadcaster and presenter of his own show, and you can find that at warrenthornton.com. He joins me now. He is from the UK, as you can imagine, but he actually joins me now from the Philippines, which is closely aligned to our time zone here in Australia. Warren, welcome. Firstly, what are you doing in the Philippines?
Good morning, Simeon. I thought once Keir Starmer got into power, it might be a good idea if I took off to the Philippines, having already been arrested for exposing the Nazi in the Canadian Parliament, which is a story that we broke.
So you were arrested for exposing the Nazi in Trudeau's Canadian Parliament?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Basically, we found out that he had indeed been a British prisoner of war at the time. And of course, once I broke the story on the Friday, and then suddenly on the Sunday, I got a visit from the police when I was actually taking part in the show. We absolutely proved that Trudeau, Freeland, Gould all knew about this because literally Rota accepted money from Yaroslav Hunker's son. Which was for his campaign. So the Speaker of the House received money from Yaroslav Hunker's son, who was in charge of a mining corporation and actually lived in the same area.
Amazing, Warren, that you were involved in exposing that Yaroslav Hunker, the Ukrainian Nazi who spoke in the Canadian Parliament. And it's even more amazing that you've been persecuted for that, arrested. Can I ask, what did the British police charge you with when they arrested you for exposing that Nazi in Canada?
It was a weird thing. It was a very weird thing, Simeon, to be honest, because misinformation is when you know it to be false and you still publish it. Sorry, that's when you know it to be false, when you don't know it to be false, sorry. And then, of course, you publish it. Disinformation is when you know it to be false and you still publish it. But I was arrested for malinformation, which means I was absolutely accurate in what I was reporting, but they just didn't want it in the public sphere. And of course, being part of a journalist, as you know, Simeon, if they mislead either people or a corporation, then you have a duty and a right to expose that to the public.
Well, mate, in normal countries, in normal societies, exposing a Nazi, a person who served in the Nazi Third Reich regime during the Second World War, it would be something which would be highly looked upon, and you should be receiving a medal instead of a pair of handcuffs. I mean, what happened to Britain? Britain and Russia and the Soviet Union were on the same side fighting the Nazis, and the British supplied the Russians with Hurricane fighters and ammunition and shells, and the Soviet Unions via the Arctic Sea route in the northern Arctic sent ships full of gold back to the British from Russia. I mean, we were on the same side. What's going on? Why? Where has this disconnect occurred, in your opinion? Why are Nazis being rehabilitated and supported by the British government, by the Canadian government all of a sudden? Isn't that an absolute travesty and a mockery of the memory and the legacy of all the British veterans who died in World War II fighting Nazism?
Yes, it absolutely is. And of course, there was never anything worse than in the Normandy, obviously, when they had the Normandy celebrations, that someone like Zelensky would turn up. Now, people will turn around and say, oh, Zelensky's Jewish. Well, let's push a point there, shall we? With Georgia at the moment, Zuba Lashvili, it's been found out that her grandfather actually served on the Georgian desk for the RSHA underneath Reinhold Heydrich, and Reinhold Heydrich himself was a Jew. So let's not, split hairs about Zelensky there. And what you then have to turn around and say about where the UK have gone with this is we've just been led by the nose by America, very, very simply. You know, and I know that the Maidan Square, or the massacre that happened in the Maidan, was completely driven by Victoria Nuland and the National Endowment for Democracy. And then, of course, very simply, they put men into the Hotel Ukraine and started shooting their own side so that everybody would then go and overthrow. And exactly the same thing is happening in Georgia. We're just waiting for the people to start dying.
Absolutely. It's the playbook. And I do apologize. Last week's broadcast, I incorrectly referred to Victoria Nuland as Jessica Nuland. But Warren has correctly named her as the person sponsoring behind the Ukrainian Maidan of 2014, same playbook, handing out cookies and snacks on the streets, fireworks, and paying hooligans and thugs. In fact, I read an article today that 30% of those protesters on the streets of Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, are actually foreigners, and they're not even Georgians. So they're importing these protesters. They're paying them, and that is the classic playbook, the color revolution playbook, which the West uses. And I'm very happy and glad to say that it looks like Russia, and should I say Georgia, most importantly, the Georgian people are much more prepared, and they're not naive about these type of things. That it's not democracy, it's not the will of the people, it's not some organic movement where people are gathering and protesting and standing up for some type of righteous cause. It is absolutely artificial, it's foreign, and it is well financed, well organized, and we know who finances it. We know who organizes it. It's the Pentagon, it's the CIA, it's those organizations which bring chaos and harm and destabilize countries and governments and societies all around the world. So well done to the Georgian people for holding the line on that one.
And there is something I'd like to say on that, because obviously we had your lady Katerina, who's giving you a hard time and saying that consulates shouldn't be used. Well, let's be absolutely straight here. When it comes to using consulates, a young lady intern from the American embassy was one of the people out there rioting the other night against the Georgian government and actually throwing things. And then, of course, we had the mock fake blood showing that she was injured. But then, of course, as soon as it was reported, nobody sought to possibly cover up her face. And by facial recognition, you were able to find out that she was an intern who'd been working at the US Embassy for the last 9 months. So what is the US Embassy doing on Georgian soil, throwing rocks and fireworks and missiles at the Georgian government?
Absolutely. I agree with you on that, and that's something which has been also exposed, that U.S. Embassy employees are involved in protesting in Georgia. It's not surprising at all, to be quite honest, and it's their classic tactics. What can I say? This is why we say no to NATO. This is why we say no to war, because this is how it starts. It starts with cookies. It starts with these fake protesters, and then if you're not careful, if you don't stop and cut the head off the snake immediately and stop these type of interference actions, and this is real interference. We're not talking about a larrikin Australian with the Russian heritage riling up the crowds on the streets of Sydney and having a good time like I was doing over the years. All self-financed, by the way. Not a cent of support from Russia or the Kremlin, no instructions from the Kremlin. I mean, that is what we're doing is kindergarten compared to what these guys are doing. These guys have military style and corporate style execution of their plans. I mean, if I had the resources that Victoria Nuland had and the US Embassy in Georgia had, well, what can I say? I don't even want to speculate what would we do, what would we achieve, because we could clearly running on an empty gas tank, running on fumes, you could say, we're having an impact, and that's causing much grief for these Ukrainian spokespersons and senators like Simon Birmingham. It's causing grief for them. But you know what? Our action is organic, and no one plans this show. No one, you and I don't collaborate beforehand and say, what are you going to talk about? Let's talk about this. Here's a script. Let's say that. We don't plan anything. And guys, guess what? Nobody funds this. The Kremlin does not fund No2Nato. It's a completely organic, excellent initiative, which has been brought about by the brilliant George Galloway. And we're all very happy to oblige and be part of it, because it's something that is extremely needed. And we're fortunate that George Galloway has a very staunch and strong reputation, where the corporate big tech giants are just simply too afraid to take him off the air because he's such a big name. And he offers his platform as a place where we can discuss this type of anti-NATO, no-to-NATO ideology. And that's an excellent thing. Very organic. Yes.
There is a point I'd like to make, actually, Simeon, about what was being said by Mick. Now, there are 73,000, obviously, troops in the British Army. Only 40,000 of them are really going to be any good in the fighting. You've got admin, you've got all sorts of people who don't really get involved in the fighting. Now, what you have to remember is, first of all, they sent loads and loads of mercs in there. The wonderful Liz Truss sent 30-odd people to their deaths, literally, to a training camp just the other side, just inside the Ukraine border, on the border with Poland. And, of course, these wonderful mercenaries all kept their cell phones on and were taking selfies and everything else. and one missile basically sorted them all out. So Liz Truss telling people to put down their, call of duty and go and do this is absolutely crazy. War is a horrible, horrible thing. And when you're in one, as I have been, when you see the human suffering and everything else, the last thing you would be doing is taking your mobile phone or any electronic devices whatsoever. You wouldn't be going into restaurants with everybody else. And of these, when you think that there's only 40,000 possible fighting force for the British Army, they wouldn't last a year. In Bakhmut alone, the Ukrainians lost 120,000 men in 8 months. So you slice that down by 3 times that, they wouldn't last 6 months, let alone a year. And very, very simply, the British Army would be wiped out. We're not used to it. The warfare has moved on. Men and tanks are no good anymore. Drones and missiles are the way that you fight a war. I was at the Chinese embassy only 8 days ago, and I saw a demonstration on drone technology and how far they've gone that would frighten the living daylights out of people.
Look, China is the sleeping dragon, and they are very, very advanced in drones. Their drone and missile production, it out produces the rest of the world put together times 10. I mean, the Chinese drone production for the civilian market, it dwarfs what most countries' militaries combined would ever dream of on paper even. But the Chinese are well ahead, and guess what? China is an ally of Russia, and that is very clear. In fact, China and Russia have said, we've heard it, they've said we are more than allies, we are more than brothers, and the relationship is very close. China shares a common border with Russia. North Korea shares a common border with Russia. So if this is going to be a long, drawn-out war, if they don't want to settle this conflict on Russia's terms and to respect Russia's sovereignty and to respect Russia's interests on Russia's borders and to respect Russia's right to defend the Russian-speaking Russian Orthodox and Ukrainian Orthodox Christian population, which are being persecuted in Ukraine by Zelensky, who is a person who is not Christian, and he does not care about those people that live there. If they don't want to take into account Russia's position, it's going to escalate. It's going to get worse. Now, you as a veteran, as a person who's been serving in the military for many, many years, a long distinguished career in the British Army, you would surely acknowledge that the number one country in the world, and of course Ukraine being the number 2 country, I would say, who has the most experience fighting against drones, defending against drones and missiles, and also deploying drones and missiles. This is Russia and Ukraine in second place. These are 2 countries now who have incredible experience, and that's why the Chinese are sending in observation teams. They're sending in military instructors, and the Chinese are watching and learning and refining their drones. Look, just imagine Chinese manufacturing. They can commit to making 100,000 drones a week. They can just say Guangzhou region or whatever region, they say 500 factories are going to no longer produce toy cars. They're going to produce drones, and they just switch over and they start producing, and they will outproduce. They will outproduce Australia, Britain, United States, and this is the problem. If the world, if Keir Starmer, if Biden, if Albanese, if other leaders around the world, Macron, who looks like he's on his way out as well, the breaking news from France, his government is collapsing. Again, they're probably going to blame the Russians. They might even blame Aussie Cossack for it. I'm used to it. Every time something happens, it seems to point the finger at me, some type of transnational, multifunctional, international misinformation, disinformation campaign, which brought down another Western government. I would not be surprised if that's what the BBC would allege tomorrow. But all of these leaders are way out of their pay grade, way out of their depth. And the problem is, by provoking Russia, by fighting Russia, by arming Ukraine against Russia, they're making Russia into a military superpower, a powerhouse. They are forcing Russia and the Russian government, the Russian people, they're forcing Putin to say things like everyone must mobilize. I mean, when the Russian Tsar back in 1914 says we are mobilizing, that's it. That means tens of millions are being drafted into the military and the country is changing its thing. When Joseph Stalin in 1941 says, that's it, we are mobilizing, it's all bets are off. The Russian bear is awake and you can't stop it. How are you going to stop it? How are you going to stop such a huge country with such huge resources plus such huge allies? Yes, in World War II, the Soviet Union had the Americans. It had Lend-Lease. It had the British, right? It had the Arctic convoys. It had American support as well. However, that's because America back in those days and the British in those days were the manufacturing hubs of the world. That is where the majority of shells, ammunition, boots, machine guns, Vickers, factories. That's what you had them, right? You had them. The Russians were ordering them. But guess where? And you know the answer to this question because you mentioned that you've been to the embassy last week. Who now is the #1 manufacturing hub of the world? If you need something made, where do you go?
You go to China or you go to Russia. And just to expound on the point here, the Chinese had drones with sensors on that they could send into a bamboo forest. And literally, I watched these things. And there was about 400 of them, and they were attacking this trench, which was about half a mile into this forest. They got in there. They didn't need it. They just pre-programmed them for exactly where they were supposed to go. They went in there and they just destroyed this trench. And to be honest with you, it was quite frightening. And another thing I will just very quickly say, that you're not going to fight for Biden. You're not going to fight for a Sunak. You're not going to fight for a Starmer. Putin is seen not only as the leader of Russia, but he's seen as a spiritual leader as well. And you fight much harder for a spiritual leader than you do a political one.
Definitely. That's why people sympathize with Vladimir Putin, because he's managed to preserve a country which is taking active measures against the plight and the spread and the cancer of degeneracy. And that is something which the world is suffering from, the Western world. It's something which Elon Musk is suffering from on a personal level with his own son and his own family, and they call it the woke mind virus. Or there's one country which seems to be immune to these type of woke mind virus, and that is countries like Russia, countries like Belarus, and good on them. And that's why many Westerners are flocking to move to Russia.
Simeon, I would turn around and say on that that I don't think Russia stand a chance, because we're going to sail over on the HMS Diversity and Inclusion, and we're all going to be coloured up in rainbow tanks and uniforms. So the Russians won't be able to see them too well.
That's right. 25 years in the Gulag and half rations for potatoes. That should fix any of these ideological indiscrepancies, let's call them. But on a serious note, people are moving to Russia. I mean, if you're in the Philippines and you're hiding out from the British government, I would highly suggest to consider moving to Russia. Go to okaagency.com or welcome to Russia.com. There's movingtorussia.ru. There's plenty of these organizations that have sprung up, and they're assisting Westerners, just like yourself, who are political prisoners, who are exiled from their own countries simply for speaking up for the truth and standing their ground and holding the line. So, Warren Thornton, I'm sure you would be extremely welcomed in Russia, and a person with your experience in the British military would definitely find an office in Russia or a colonel in Russia who would have a nice cup of tea with you, polonium-free, and collaborate with you on issues of culture, traditions, and military history.
Yes,
speaking. I mean, Marina Butina, Russian State Deputy Duma member, only yesterday declared that every foreigner who is thinking of moving to Russia will find a place for that foreigner. There is a skill shortage in Russia because of the sanctions, because of the fact that all these Western companies withdrew. Russia is very eager to attract Westerners, engineers, huge wages, massive wages, scientists, Western people with skills in industry, in commerce, wherever you like. If you've got a skill, they'll find where best to use it. Russia is open for business. And you know what? Foreigners are really, really well treated in Russia.
That's the other thing, Simeon. That's the other thing as well. We keep hearing in the West that Russia's economy is in the toilet. No, it isn't, because they're desperate for people. Because their economy is growing so fast, they don't have enough people to be able to fulfill all the roles that are needed in Russia. So the economy is going through the roof. And this nonsense about the ruble in trouble and Russia being in some sort of economic problems. Absolutely untrue. Just look at Germany. It's absolutely falling through the floor.
Well, look, Russia is fighting a war for cash. Now, that is the only country in the world in the last, I don't know how many years, if you compare it to the United States and the British and others, who actually fights a war for cash. All of these wars that America funds, it doesn't actually fund them. They're just adding zeros onto the American debt, which is growing by $1 trillion every 90 days or whatever it is. No, the Russians are not in debt. They are selling oil and gas, right, to Europe, by the way. And in fact, oil pipelines are still going through Ukraine. So there's a war between Russia and Ukraine, but the Ukrainians are happy enough to continue to allow Russian oil through the Druzhba pipeline, and it's pumped through the Ukraine, and Ukraine gets its royalties for transit of that Russian oil. So it's a bit of a phony war, isn't it? It's certainly not a
not a full-blown.
Not a full-blown war. It really is a special operation. Countries like India buying Russian oil more than ever, and then selling it back to Europe, selling it back to Australia. And Russia is using
inflated prices.
Of course, and the Indians very cheeky, very clever. They're making their 30% cut on top, and good on them. Well done to them. The Chinese buying huge amounts of Russian gas, coal, oil, and selling it on to other countries like Japan and Australia and other places. Now, that's the difference. The Russians are fighting a war on cash, spending 1/3 of their federal budget. So 33% of the whole budget. That's compared to countries in the West who are spending 1.5% of their GDP or 2% of the GDP maximum, or 3 or 4% would be very unusual for them to spend. Russia is doing well, and it's doing a good job considering the fact that it's up against the military-industrial complex, the military intelligence networks, and the mercenaries and instructors of 55 countries. 55 countries.
Yeah.
So when people say, "Oh, why hasn't Russia taken over all of Ukraine yet?" Well, Russia never sought to do that. If you look at the borders that Russia declared, they are very, very similar to the borders that Russia has, plus or minus, right? That's the Kherson region. And by the way, the Ukrainians are declaring that the Russians are preparing an offensive onto the city of Kherson across the river Dnieper, and they've amassed 300 boats for that river crossing. That's unconfirmed information. It could be Ukrainian propaganda, but that's something that the enemy is worried about. At the end of the day, the peace proposals that are on the table, there are different proposals. There are calls for Russia to keep what it has. And but that's not negotiable. There is no scenario where Russia would withdraw or give up land that it's earned. This land, every meter of that land, every meter, especially if we're looking at Donbass and looking at Donetsk, places like Bakhmut, Artyomovsk, or Avdiivka, every meter, every block, every street of these cities, house to house, building to building, the old-fashioned way, right? The old-fashioned way, just like Pavlov's house in Stalingrad, was fought for and taken. Some buildings being fought over for weeks and weeks and weeks. And the Russians
they're unbelievably deluded, Simeon. I mean, we're hearing about this ridiculous plan that the Americans have got. You will give the Russians exactly what they want. There will be none of this frozen conflict. There's no way that Putin's going to have any of that. There is no joining NATO in 5, 10, 20, 30 years. There really isn't. And there are 8 Russian-speaking oblasts there. I would imagine that the Russians will take the 4 oblasts to start with, and they will want autonomous elections to be held in the other 4 oblasts. And if they leave it much longer, it's going to be 8 oblasts in the Russian hands. So give them what they want, get rid of Zelensky, knock this neo-Nazi nonsense on the head, and turn around and say that Ukraine is never going to join NATO, because otherwise the Russians will just keep winning and the Ukrainians will just keep losing, and everybody else economically will go down the toilet. Look how many, shall we say, Western leaders have fallen because of supporting Zelensky.
The curse of Zelensky's handshake.
Yes.
Strike again. The South Korean president also became a victim of that curse. The latest.
I do mean to ask you, Simeon, have you seen any North Koreans under the bed lately?
Well, the allegations are that there are many North Koreans. In fact, an Australian mercenary fighter from Queensland told the Australian news outlet news.com.au yesterday that he has killed North Koreans. I mean, of course, no
proof
evidence given, no photos provided, no evidence whatsoever. No. Now, the thing is, the Western propaganda machine is alleging that North Koreans may be operating in Kursk region. But the problem for the West is that the Kursk region is part of Russia's pre-war undisputed sovereign territory. So if Russia allows North Korean troops or Syrian troops or Iranian troops or Kazakhstanian troops or Belarusian troops or whoever or whatever, Chinese troops, whoever they like, if they allow them onto Russian territory, the West can't say anything. I mean, I understand if North Korean troops were fighting outside Kiev. Okay, it would be a bit alarming. You could say, oh, well, that's not very nice, is it? But that's not happening. Vladimir Putin has clearly said and clearly stated that Russia and North Korea have a mutual strategic military assistance pact that they've signed, and that is in action. And in the guidelines of that agreement, Russia, if it allows North Korean military assets to be deployed on its own territory, who can stop Russia? It's the same thing as when the Americans come to Australia and in Townsville or in Cairns or in Darwin conduct military exercises at the invitation of the Australian government. So,
and the other thing there as well, Simeon, is very, very straightforward. North Korea was just using an excuse to launch, to give them permission, Ukraine permission, to launch weapons, long-range weapons, into Russia. And of course, at the moment, I would imagine Kim Jong-un is chuckling left, right, and centre, because South Korea, once again, for the 11th time, has completely had a meltdown. And of course, North Korea is about as stable as you could possibly imagine.
Well done to the North Koreans for being stable. And I could just imagine the North Korean news reporting on the chaos in South Korea, and the North Koreans sitting here at home thinking, it turns out we are right after all these years. So, look, congratulations to the North Korean people. They went through a lot of toil and hardship, but as they say, it's not over till the fat lady sings, and it looks like the South Korean fat lady is singing, and they got big problems over there. So well done to the North Koreans. And the North Koreans do have very good advanced missiles, and they have great MLRS rockets, and that is an asset which Russia is using and absorbing, and it's thanks to the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, who built up countries like North Korea, like Cuba, like all these countries in Africa and Eastern Europe, and a lot of this investment that they made is now being given back in that sense, and it's a great thing. Russia has allies. Ukraine thinks it's allies. Ukraine doesn't have allies. Ukraine has countries.
Simeon, I wanted to ask you a question. Given that Russia have just signed a deal with Nicaragua to build a base there, which is only 3,000 miles away from America, how long do you think it will take the American government to try and overthrow the government in Nicaragua?
Well, there'll be cookies and protesters, color revolution incoming. But look, that's the thing. Russia doesn't meddle on America's borders. It's like if Russia started arming the Mexican cartels and giving them surface-to-air missiles and artillery systems and rockets, and they could if they wanted to. Really, if the Russians really wanted to be nasty like the Americans are, they could, but they don't, because the Russians, I believe that the Russians have honor and chivalry, and they do things the old-fashioned way, which is why they're fighting this war in the conventional sense. Building to building, trench to trench, meter by meter, kilometer by kilometer, a grueling fighting war, which is costing lives, costing men. It's a lot of heroism. It's a lot of work. And that's what the Russians call it. They say, we're working brothers.
This is the thing, Simeon, that people haven't got yet, have they? That when the West keep pushing, and they're pushing for lowering the mobilization age, and the Ukrainians haven't got this yet. They really haven't worked it out yet, that they will keep them going until there is no Ukrainians left, because the Georgians were meant to be the backup in case Ukraine lost the war. And of course, that didn't turn out too well, because Georgia Dream got it. So the Georgians aren't there to be used. And now they want the mobilization lowered and lowered and lowered. What's your thoughts on that, Tim?
Well, absolutely. And I can see in the comment section, Ebony Lightfoot, shout out to her from Melbourne in Australia. Russia has a sense of responsibility as a global citizen. That is how they differ from the US. And that's the difference when we compare what Russia is doing and what the United States is doing. The United States thrives on the misery and the chaos and the civil war that it brings to other parts of the world, because that literally holds up and pins up the American economy. They need problems. They need war in Syria, in Libya, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, in South America. They need regime change. Sudan. They need genocide. They need to continue the war machine, because if they don't have a war machine, if they don't have perpetual conflicts, as Assange called them, forever wars, if they don't have that, it grinds to a halt. The huge military-industrial complex, which plays such a key role in the American economy, and most importantly, not only the manufacturing side of things, but it's more so the lobby side of things. All of these American defense Department of Defense bigwigs, when they retire, where do they go and get a cushy job at?
Military industrial complex.
And it's the same thing in Australia. Christopher Pyne, defense minister, retires, and all of a sudden the next day he's given $1 million a year contract to be an advisor on the board of a lobby group or a advisory board to some defense company. And that's more so where the money is constantly churning over in Washington. And that's why Russia doesn't have that problem. The Russian military industrial complex is 98% state owned.
In your opinion, Simeon, which one are they going to panic over first, Nicaragua or Romania?
Yeah, that's a good point. The Romanian government, who has just won the election, is a pro-Russian government, which is a great thing, and that's well done to the Romanian people. Romanian people, again, Christian Orthodox, they identify very closely, sympathize with the Russians, and it's no surprise that a pro-Russian government has come to power there. Again, they want to blame Russia for that, but it's only natural that in Hungary the people are sympathetic to Russia, that in Slovakia the people are sympathetic to Russia, and in Serbia, of course, hands down, they're sympathetic to Russia, and they always have been. And all around Europe now, these governments that are sweeping to power are sympathetic to Russia, because Europeans, especially Germans, East Germany especially, they do not want another European war. And they can see daily the trains going east loaded with tanks and armored personnel carriers through their villages and towns. They can see on the highways the trucks loaded with NATO gear, and they realize that Europe is going to war. And if you want to go to war with Russia, okay, you can, but just know Russians are ready, and Russia has a head start. Russia has a head start in the war that is about to, you could say, or is already underway, World War III, because Russia has been preparing for this. Thanks to all the sanctions that were put against Russia, thanks to all the economic sanctions and sanctions on spare parts, and I mean, Australia even put sanctions on bolts and nuts and screwdrivers to Russia. That's the extent of it all. But it's thanks to that Russia managed to slowly, gradually adapt and fill those gaps in the sanctions. And that's, again, another reason why Western specialists, and if you're watching and you are an engineer or you're a skilled worker or you have a trade, you're a welder, you're a shipbuilder, whatever you're doing, whatever you are, I encourage you, go to okagency.com or another Russian group, or ring up your nearest Russian embassy or consulate and tell them, I'm good at this, I want to move to Russia, can you find me a job? And they will find you a job. You can move from Southampton to St. Petersburg and you can build ships for the Russian military. So it sounds like I'm recruiting here. We'll probably get shut down.
The recruiting place, it's not such a bad idea, but you have to remember that even Henry Kissinger turned around and said that literally being an enemy of America is a bad idea. Being a friend of America is absolutely lethal. We need, as Europe itself, but definitely the UK, needs to edge away from America, unless, of course, because Trump eventually, I would imagine, is going to go into Israel. There's going to be a problem there, and there's going to be a problem with China eventually as well. So being a friend of America never works out well for anybody.
Indeed. I think that a lot of people are waking up, and the key to waking more people up is to supporting broadcasts like this and supporting your work, Warren Thornton. Check out Warren's website. It's warrenthornton.com to keep track of his excellent journalism and work. He's a British journalist, former sniper. He's a veteran of the British Army, forced to be in exile in the Philippines. Warren, of course, if you need to go to Russia, go there, drop my name, say the Aussie Cossack sent you, and I'm sure they'll look after you. They'll set you up there.
Thank you very much. It's quite warm and balmy in the Philippines, and I get a nice warm welcome from the Chinese embassy.
That's very, very suspicious, Warren.
Of course.
You're definitely going to be you're going to be questioned at Heathrow Airport when you fly back in with that kind of attitude.
I'll meet you there, Simi.
Definitely. Good on you, Warren. Thank you very much. Warren Thornton for joining us on No2Nato. Well, ladies and gentlemen, what a great show, great guests. I enjoy speaking with people from the British military, veterans from the British military. And thank you to our team, Alan and Chris and Paul and everyone in the Birmingham and Bristol No2Nato team who have been hard at work, always preparing these broadcasts for you. If you want to support No2Nato, again, it's not a Kremlin-funded project. It's not funded by any government. It's funded by crowdfunding, and you can continue supporting this show, this channel, this great work. The financial appeal help raise if you can. If you can't, if you need help yourself, write to us and we'll help you. We'll send you a check if you need help. This appeal only concerns those people who have bought Bitcoin and it's sitting at 103,000. So if you're a Bitcoin whale and you're doing well, support the show. But there we go. It was a good show. I appreciate you guys in the comment section. And tune in next week at the same time for another episode of No2Nato. In the meantime, keep sharing the truth, keep sharing this broadcast, hit like, hit subscribe, and we'll keep fighting. Svetlana, Horatio, James, Tony, I can see all your comments. Thank you very much for your support. The world is changing quickly. We are on the right side of history, and if you're watching this broadcast, you are on the right side of history. The good news is, in the end, we win. We don't have the resources of BBC or CNN or CNBC and so forth, or Hollywood or Wall Street, and we don't need them because people who have those resources become compromised. So when you see a show like this preaching the truth, things that you want to hear from different perspectives from all around the world, and you can make your own decision about who's right and who's wrong, it's a good thing, and it has to be supported. Thanks very much. I'm your host, the Aussie Cossack. Until next time.